The golden pen hovered over the contract, its weight heavy with promises of wealth. Promises that would change everything. But then, in the silence of the crowded office, a voice cut through the air, trembling with urgency. "Don't sign it. It's a trap." All eyes turned toward the girl standing in the doorway, dirty, disheveled, her face gaunt from hunger and sleepless nights. A homeless girl, desperate and wild-eyed, was standing between a millionaire and the deal of his life. The room fell silent. Who was she? And why did she sound like she knew something none of them did? The millionaire's hand trembled. Was she mad? Or had she just saved him from a fate worse than death? In that single moment, everything shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sun was setting over the sprawling city skyline, casting long, golden shadows on the polished floors of Morrison Towers, the towering symbol of success and ambition. Inside, the penthouse apartment glistened with luxury, Italian marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city below, and walls lined with expensive art. At the heart of it all, Thomas Morrison sat at his sleek mahogany desk, his fingers lightly grazing the edges of a contract that had the power to change his life forever. A billionaire at 35, Thomas had built his empire from the ground up. He was the type of man whose name appeared in headlines, whose business deals shook industries. His phone buzzed incessantly with congratulatory messages. Yet none of them brought him the peace he so desperately sought. Thomas had everything: money, power, influence. But something gnawed at him, an emptiness that he couldn't escape. Was it the price of success? Or the hollow feeling that no matter how much he achieved, there was always something or someone missing? As he looked out the window, he caught his reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, a face aged by constant stress, a man weighed down by a life he had worked so hard to build. Was it worth it? The question lingered, but he quickly dismissed it. Tonight was the night. Tonight, he would sign the deal that would secure his legacy forever. At that very moment, in a small, dimly lit alley just blocks away from Morrison Towers, a girl huddled beneath a tattered blanket. Her face was pale, her clothes ragged, and her eyes haunted. Her name was Emma. Once, she had lived in a cozy apartment and had dreams of making it big. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. And now, she was nothing but a shadow in the underbelly of the city, unnoticed and forgotten by the world above. Emma's stomach growled painfully, but it was the nagging thought in her head that kept her up at night. She had seen something at the heart of Thomas Morrison's empire that she couldn't unsee, a secret buried deep within his upcoming deal, one that would destroy everything he had built and ruin countless lives. She didn't know why she felt compelled to stop it, but something deep inside told her it was the right thing to do. She had to warn him. She didn't know how or why, but if she didn't, it would all come crashing down: his empire, his future, and her last chance at redemption. Back at the penthouse, Thomas signed the contract with a swift, decisive stroke. He glanced up, just as his assistant, Olivia, entered the room, her face radiant with excitement. "Mr. Morrison, everything's set for the signing ceremony tomorrow," she said, unaware of the dark cloud looming just beyond the horizon. But just as Thomas opened his mouth to respond, a sudden, frantic knock on the door interrupted them. "Who could that be?" Olivia murmured, her eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Thomas froze, his hands still on the contract, an unexplainable chill running down his spine. He didn't know it yet, but this knock would change everything. The stage is set. We know Thomas is at the peak of his success, but his wealth has come at the cost of his peace. Meanwhile, Emma, living in the shadows, is driven by an urgent need to expose a secret that could bring everything down. But who is Emma really? What exactly has she uncovered? And why does she feel so compelled to warn Thomas? The tension between their worlds is palpable, and the moment they collide is imminent. Thomas Morrison leaned forward, his signature pen in hand, ready to finalize the deal that would ensure his place in history. The papers in front of him were nothing short of a fortune, an exclusive partnership with a foreign conglomerate that promised to double his wealth. All he had to do was sign, and the next chapter of his life would be written in gold. But as his pen hovered above the contract, a sharp, panicked voice broke the moment. "Don't sign it. It's a trap." The voice came from nowhere. The room, once filled with quiet anticipation, fell into stunned silence. Thomas's hand froze, his eyes flicking up to the door where a figure stood, small, fragile, almost ghostly under the harsh lights. It was a girl, no older than 20, her hair matted and unkempt, her face streaked with dirt. Her clothes were torn, and she looked like she hadn't slept or eaten in days. A homeless girl? What was she doing here? Emma's eyes locked onto Thomas's. There was a desperate wildness in them, like a person standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing if they took one more step, it would be their last. "You don't know what you're about to do," she continued, her voice shaky but urgent. "That contract, it's not what it seems." The tension in the room escalated. The lawyers and investors around the table exchanged confused glances, unsure whether they were witnessing some kind of bizarre stunt. But Thomas felt something deep inside, a sense of unease, as if the walls of the room were closing in on him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady, yet tinged with disbelief. Emma's eyes darted nervously, as if she were about to flee, but she stayed rooted to the spot. "It doesn't matter who I am. It matters what you're about to do." She took a cautious step forward, her bare feet silently brushing against the polished floor. There was a strange intensity in her gaze, like she could see right through him. "I don't have much time," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder, her voice barely audible. "But if you sign that paper, you'll lose everything more than your money. They'll destroy you. The deal, it's a lie. They want to use you as a pawn." A cold shiver ran down Thomas's spine. He glanced at the others in the room, still stunned, still unsure of how to respond. One of the lawyers, a well-dressed man in his late 40s, finally cleared his throat. "Whoever this is, she has no business here," he said, his tone sharp. "Please, Mr. Morrison, just ignore this distraction. Let's get back to the matter at hand." But Thomas didn't respond. His eyes were still on Emma. There was something in her voice, something in the frantic fear in her eyes, that made him pause. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. Emma was shaking, her hands clutching the edges of her ragged jacket, her breath coming out in sharp gasps. "They'll do anything to keep you from knowing the truth," she said, her words spilling out in a desperate rush. "You're not just signing a business deal. You're signing away your freedom." The room grew quiet. The murmurs and whispers of the lawyers and investors faded into the background. All that was left was the sound of Emma's voice and the pounding of Thomas's heart. He stared at the contract again, the ink of his signature hovering just above the paper. His mind raced. Could it be true? Could this girl, this stranger, really know something about the deal that no one else did? His gut told him there was more to this than met the eye. But who was she? Why was she warning him? And what would it cost him if he chose to listen? But before he could ask another question, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder by the second. Someone was coming. Emma's eyes widened in panic. "You have to trust me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Don't sign it. Please don't sign it. You'll regret it." As the door swung open, revealing the imposing figure of a tall man in a sharp suit, the moment exploded into chaos. The door slammed open, and in walked the CEO of the foreign conglomerate, the one who had been behind the deal, the one who stood to gain the most from Thomas's signature. His eyes flicked to Emma, then to Thomas. There was a coldness in his smile, something calculating, something dangerous. "What's this?" the CEO asked smoothly, but his eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. Could he trust this girl? Or was this all part of a game far bigger than he ever imagined? And just before the tension could break, Emma whispered urgently, "Don't sign it. It's not what you think." The millionaire was caught between two worlds, one that promised him everything and one that threatened to destroy him. The choice was his, but was he ready to face the consequences of either path? Emma stood there, trembling as she stared at the sea of well-dressed figures in front of her. The polished suits, the designer shoes, the smug faces. These people didn't belong in her world. They didn't understand her world. They didn't see the danger that was looming over them. The contract they were about to sign? It wasn't just a business deal. It was a trap. And if Thomas signed, there would be no going back. She had tried to warn others before. Over and over, she had begged, pleaded with people to listen to her, but no one ever did. They always brushed her off, writing her off as nothing more than a homeless girl, a nobody with no credibility. But she couldn't let that stop her now. She swallowed hard, her throat tight from a mix of fear and the pounding of her heart. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. Was she truly doing the right thing? Should she have stayed silent and gone back to the streets where she was safe, invisible? Her mind flashed back to the night before, when she had overheard the conversation that had shattered her fragile sense of security. A powerful voice, a voice she had once trusted, had spoken of betrayal, of a scheme to take everything from Thomas. A scheme that had been carefully woven over the course of months, with a single purpose, to destroy him. But how could she prove it? How could she convince these high-powered people, these sharks in suits, that they were being led into a trap? Just as she opened her mouth to speak again, the door behind her slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass windows. She turned sharply, her pulse racing, as two burly security guards marched into the room. One of them, a stocky man with a stern face, stepped forward and growled, "What are you doing here?" Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her legs suddenly weak. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her every move. Was it too late to leave? But then her eyes met Thomas's again, and she saw something there, a flicker of doubt, of curiosity. She wasn't sure if it was enough, but it was something. Thomas blinked, still not quite processing what was happening. The girl, Emma, was shaking now, pleading, but he couldn't shake the strange sensation crawling down his spine. There was something about her, something in her voice that made him feel uneasy. The room was thick with tension, the air crackling with confusion. Everyone around the table had dismissed her as a crazy woman. Yet Thomas couldn't ignore the sense of foreboding growing in his chest. Something about the contract, about the deal he was about to make, didn't sit right. He glanced at his lawyer, Jeremy, who stood at his side with a look of irritation. "It's a business deal, Thomas. Don't listen to her," Jeremy said, his voice low but firm. But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. His mind raced back to the conversation he had had earlier that week, when the deal had first been presented. It had seemed too good to be true, too perfect. But he had been so caught up in the excitement of expanding his empire, he hadn't stopped to think about the cost. What was the price? And who, in the end, would be left paying it? The contract in front of him felt heavier now, its edges sharp, like it was a weapon waiting to be used against him. He was about to sign it. He was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. "What exactly is this trap you're talking about?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm despite the storm raging inside of him. He stood, his eyes never leaving Emma's. Emma swallowed hard and took a step forward, her hands shaking. I overheard something. There's someone close to you, someone you trust, who has been planning to take your company from under you. It's all in the contract, the fine print. They've been working with this foreign conglomerate for months to siphon off your assets, your resources, and make sure you lose everything. The deal isn't about growth. It's about destruction. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He reached for the papers, scanning them quickly, his fingers trembling. He knew the numbers. He knew the names. But Emma was right about one thing. The fine print, he hadn't read it. He scanned the document, his eyes widening as he saw what she had meant. Siphoning assets, hidden clauses, a deal with conditions that didn't favor him at all. And then, it hit him. The stake wasn't just about money. It was about control, his control over his own empire, his legacy. "You're telling me—" Thomas's voice cracked, but he forced himself to continue. "You're telling me this whole deal is a setup?" Emma nodded, her eyes filled with urgency and desperation. They've been manipulating you from the start, Thomas. Don't sign it. Please. It's not just your company. It's your future. A beat of silence passed between them, and in that moment, Thomas felt the weight of the decision hanging over him. He had always been the one pulling the strings, the one who controlled his fate. But now it felt like the strings were slipping through his fingers and he was no longer sure who was in control. Behind him, the door slammed open again, and Jeremy's voice rang out, sharp and accusing. What are you doing? You can't listen to this girl. She's insane. But Thomas didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Emma, a sinking feeling growing in his chest. He had just stepped into something far deeper than he had ever anticipated. And now there was no turning back. As the door shut with a soft thud, the room seemed to close in on Thomas. The contract on his desk was no longer just paper. It was a ticking time bomb. The door slammed shut with a deafening echo, and the room fell into a suffocating silence. Everyone turned their eyes to Emma, who was still standing by the door, her face pale but determined. But now, she wasn't the only one feeling the weight of the moment. The tension in the room had shifted. Something was off. The two burly men who had entered the room were not just security guards. They wore the same cold, calculating expressions as the investors seated around the table, their eyes gleaming with a kind of predatory interest. Emma's pulse spiked as she realized that they weren't here to protect Thomas. They were here to silence her. Get out! One of them barked, his voice thick with menace. Now! But Emma didn't move. She couldn't. She had come too far to back down now. They were the ones who were wrong. They were the ones who needed to see the truth. You don't know what you're doing, she said, her voice shaking but steady. This isn't just about money. This is about everything, your life, Thomas. Your legacy. Everything you've built is about to be destroyed. For a moment, Thomas stood frozen, his brow furrowed in confusion, his gaze flicking from Emma to the men who were clearly trying to push her out. Then, a sharp voice cut through the air, calm yet cold, as if everything was already in motion. Let her speak. All eyes turned to the head of the table. Victor Reynolds, Thomas's closest advisor and the one person he trusted more than anyone else in the room. Thomas's stomach churned as Victor's gaze met his eyes dark and calculating. Victor, what are you talking about? Thomas asked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Victor's lips curled into a knowing smile, but there was no warmth behind it. You still don't get it, do you? He stood slowly, the shadows of the room seemingly deepening around him. You've been played, Thomas. This deal you're about to sign? It's not a partnership. It's your undoing. The words hit like a punch to the gut. The shock on Thomas's face was immediate. His body stiffened, and for the first time, he saw the flicker of something cold and predatory in Victor's eyes. What are you saying? Thomas stammered, stepping back from the desk as his hand fell away from the pen. Why would you? Before he could finish, Emma stepped forward, her voice now sharper, cutting through the tension like a knife. Victor's been orchestrating this whole thing. He's been setting you up to fail, to fall, from the very beginning. This contract is designed to steal everything from you. Your empire, your reputation. Everything you've worked for is just a pawn in his game. For a moment, the room stood still, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Thomas's mind raced as he processed what Emma had just revealed. His pulse thundered in his ears. Could it really be true? Victor's smile didn't fade. In fact, it widened, as if savoring the moment. Oh, Emma, you poor, deluded girl. You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy? His voice dripped with mock sympathy. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Thomas was always meant to be a stepping stone. He's nothing but a tool for my next big move. The words hit like ice water. The pieces clicked into place for Thomas. Victor wasn't just an advisor. He was the mastermind behind the entire plot. He had been using Thomas as a pawn in a much larger scheme to take control of the company, using his wealth, influence, and trust to manipulate him into making decisions that would inevitably lead to his downfall. Emma's voice cut through the tension again. I overheard everything. Last night, When you thought no one was listening, Victor's eyes flashed with fury, but it was too late. The truth was already out, and for the first time, Thomas saw the man he had trusted for years for what he truly was, a predator. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as the gravity of the betrayal washed over him. His vision blurred. The faces of the people around him, once allies, now felt distant, foreign. He had been a fool. The man he had trusted, the man who had helped him rise to the top, was the very one who had orchestrated his fall. But as the weight of it all pressed down on him, another realization settled in. He still had a chance. He wasn't too far gone. He could still fight. With one swift motion, he reached for the contract, snatched it from the table and ripped it in half. The sound of paper tearing echoed through the room, the finality of the action hanging in the air. Victor's eyes widened, his calm facade cracking. "What are you doing?" he hissed. But Thomas stood tall, his voice steady now. "You won't win. Not this time." Emma's face softened as she watched him, relief flooding through her like a wave. She had warned him, and he had listened. It was the first time in years that she felt a sense of hope stir within her. Victor's face twisted in rage, but there was no turning back. His plan had been exposed, and Thomas had taken control of his own destiny. The storm wasn't over yet. The battle had just begun. But as the door slammed open and the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, it was clear. Thomas Morrison would no longer be a pawn. He was finally ready to fight back. The room seemed to hold its breath as Victor Reynolds spoke. His eyes locked onto Thomas's, his gaze unblinking, but there was something off, something not quite right. For the first time, Thomas saw through the mask. The man who had always been his ally, his confidant, was now a stranger. "You really think she knows anything?" Victor sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's just a street rat who doesn't understand how the world works. Let her go." But Emma didn't flinch. She stared Victor down with a quiet, unwavering resolve. "I know what you're doing, Victor," she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I overheard your plan last night. I know that you're trying to sell him out, trying to destroy everything he's built for your own gain." Thomas's heart dropped as the pieces began to click into place. The odd, offhand comments, the strange offers he'd been getting lately, the sudden changes in his company's structure. All of it orchestrated by the one person he had trusted the most. Victor's face twisted with anger, but Emma continued, her words now fueled by the weight of truth. "The contract you wanted him to sign? It's a poison pill. A trap that will leave you with nothing but debt and ruin. Your empire will crumble, Thomas, and he will be your downfall." Victor's eyes flicked nervously to the door, but it was already too late. The other investors, who had been silent spectators until now, were no longer passive. They looked at each other, murmurs rippling through the room as the truth began to sink in. A moment of stunned silence passed. Then, in a dramatic flash, one of the investors, Allison Drake, stood up, her face pale. "I knew something was wrong," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "You lied to us, Victor." The room erupted into chaos. But amidst the shouting and accusations, Thomas remained still, his gaze fixed on Emma. He saw not just the girl standing before him, but the courage it had taken to face down a room full of powerful people. People who had all underestimated her. As the storm of voices raged around him, Thomas walked toward Emma. For a moment, he could barely believe it. The girl he had once seen as nothing more than a shadow, someone who had no place in his world, had just saved him from making the biggest mistake of his life. Without a word, he reached out and gently took her hand. The room fell quiet once more. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. Emma blinked, her heart racing in disbelief. Was this really happening? Thomas's eyes softened as he looked down at her, the weight of everything that had just happened sinking in. "You didn't have to do this. You didn't have to risk everything for me." Emma shook her head, her eyes filled with a strange mix of relief and something more. A deep, unspoken understanding. "I had to," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Someone had to stop it." Thomas's expression hardened for a moment, but then, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. I don't know what to say, but you've earned more than my gratitude. You've earned a place in my world. The room was still in disarray, but in that moment, it felt as though everything had changed. The trap had been averted. The betrayal had been exposed. And Thomas knew that no matter what came next, he wasn't alone. As the dust settled, Thomas turned to Emma, his voice full of new purpose. Come with me, he said, offering her a chance not just to be saved, but to rebuild something greater. Let me help you. You deserve a better life than this. Emma's heart raced as she gazed at him, her eyes wide with the weight of what he was offering. Could it be real? Could her life finally be different? And in that moment, standing on the edge of a new life, she realized something she hadn't fully grasped before. Loyalty didn't have to come from where you expected it. It could come from the most unexpected places. Moral takeaway: sometimes the ones who save us are the ones we least expect. And the true measure of success isn't in the wealth we build, but in the lives we touch along the way.